the stage. Chris is the research director of Waag, and they are doing very interesting stuff, of which you can better than me share why it is interesting. So please do.
Yeah, there we go. So good afternoon, everyone. At Waag, we work a lot with citizens, and one of the main things we always try to do is kind of imbue in them certain consciousness about the world around them. So what I want to talk to you today about is a little bit more maybe methodological, a bit more, let's say, in terms of the approach we have, share that with you and explain how we connect that in our practice to the Sustainable Development Goals. So in short, for those who do not know Waag, we're an independent research institution founded 24 years ago on the basis of collaborations between hackers and artists and activists to kind of open up the internet to the civilian population, to citizens in Holland. And based on that, let's say, heritage, we've always built forth on combinations of artistic, scientific, activist, and citizen collaborations in doing research and innovation in a very hands-on way, with the stated mission of making technology and society more open, fair, and inclusive. So we're always about the combinations of new technologies and social adaptations, adoptions of those technologies. We have 60 employees and a lot of people breezing through every year in all kinds of academies and residencies and research projects. So we're a very lively organization housed in the Waag on the Nieuwmarkt building, this is the oldest drawing we have. Started building in 1424, so it's quite an old heritage we kind of live in and work with. So I don't want to rain on anyone's parade, but at Waag we kind of use Kate Raworth's donut economics as a way to kind of make these multiple development goals systemic. So to see them always in coherence, so not to see them as separate individual goals we can kind of design our way out of, or rather to understand that social and ecological questions of technology are always entwined and entangled, and we need to kind of at least have a heuristic or an image that we can understand together. Kate was so kind as to design this for us. So yeah, we work with the Sustainable Development Goals, but actually always in the context of this donut, which I hope most of you know, which basically describes the planetary boundaries we have to live within to have a sustainable life on the planet, and all the social and human rights that everybody should have access to have a proper and humane life on this planet. And the challenge, as Kate says, is to remain within these two boundaries, so to live in this green circle. And she very justly points out that economics and economists shouldn't be focused on the distribution of goods in a situation of scarcity, but rather to attempt to get everyone into the donut. We would say, of course, this is a very valid and important point for an economist to make, but actually we all, as is the discourse also here today, we all have to be in this donut. And then the question is really how to be in this donut. You know, it's nice to have these kind of boundaries and to have this goal, but the real question is how to get into it together collectively with all of us. And I think Kate's image of, let's say, a planetary system which is closed and finite, within that all these societies which have all their different cultures and processes, is a very relevant way to understand the economy as a thing that is bigger and that is embedded in bigger systems. So the main point she makes in terms of, let's say, productive questions of economy, is that there are actually 4 spheres of activity, and they're, I'd say, stacked on top of each other, starting with the intimacy of the household and our relations there, questions of consumption, of finance, etc., which is also kind of the foundation of economics in oikos in ancient Greece. Moving on to commons, which are communities, citizen collectives and cooperatives, into markets and into a state level. So I think we're working on all these levels, and it kind of helps when we're looking, for example, to market solutions or to community solutions, to understand that they're all also related, but we can actually distinguish between these various spheres where we can have impact also as designers. So Waag has a certain approach, and we call it public research. It's not necessarily our approach, it's a proposal we make to other research and innovation organizations, designers, whoever cares to listen, And the basic premise of that is that society is our research community. So everyone is involved actively in doing research and innovation activities. Only by working together with as great a number of planetary inhabitants as possible will we really achieve change. So we should need to take citizens and basically everyone very seriously, and they're involved in the research, not as kind of objects of study, but as people who are actually shaping research. And I think you can easily make research and design today interchangeable. So I'd like to develop that idea a little with you, see what you think. Yeah, usually this is a bit more staggered, but now I'll just hit you with the entire thing because it's a PDF. So we distinguish between public research, academic research, and industry research. Now the two outside ones, of course, you know of, and we see that academic research has its obvious value, but it's often takes a meta position, is kind of disconnected from action and implementation. Industry research is very much about implementation, and that's great, but it has quite a practical approach, and it sees the market as a site for validation of research. So the truth is in the market, and it has quite a utilitarian attitude, which is very solutionist, and there's a lot of space for solutionist design, but I think there's also more social and complicated practices and processes we need to kind of take into account. So we cannot only be about solutions, we have to also understand the complexity of the world and that everything is not sort of seamless and simple as we can kind of present it in these kinds of spreadsheets. So public research is, as far as we're concerned, also on a policy level, also on a European level, a very important column of research and activity that starts from social questions, starts from ethical questions, works with everyone potentially, is very interdisciplinary by default. And has very cultural framing, because if you work with one group of people, there will be very different types of knowledge, very different practices, ways of using language, symbols, etc. So you have to be very sensitive always, I think, to the context you're working with and the method you need to adopt to work with those people to get meaningful results. So at Waag we have a number of methods that we would call public research methods. This is a non-exhaustive list. There's some dots on the top. So I think this is a list that you could add to and add to and add to infinitely as the practices are present in the world. So recently I was talking to some placemakers. I think that's a great example of public research that Waag has nothing to do with, but we fully endorse within this framework. Waag does a number of things, works a lot with art and science, extending the possibilities of scientists to understand the world, act in the world, and giving artists more, let's say, technical foundations for their engaged practices. They have the user as a designer, something very well known to designers, but which goes further than service design in terms of taking the user themselves as a designer and not as a recipient of design. Do it together, co-creation processes. Commoning is a very important one. And taking smart citizens instead of smart cities as a point of departure for our approach to urban questions. So far as this pans out into a European perspective, we're an organization that's active in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, and strongly also in Europe. So we say that actually there's different approaches to social innovation, to design for a better world, which kind of, in this typology, mean that if we look to the States and the Silicon Valley model, it's all about a hyper-individual approach to innovation. It's all about private enterprise. It's private enterprise that carries us forward in this world. And the ownership and the results of those are also private. Whereas if we look towards a more Chinese model, we're talking about kind of like a total collective. Everybody's part of the same state. The state is the one that plans innovation and progress and implements it, and the ownership is also in hands of the state. So we think Europe has kind of a chance to position itself and to present itself in a more positive and, let's say, civic, optimistic light, which I think fits really well with the challenges that the Sustainable Development Goals pose to us. And that's all about being networked collectives. That's all about sharing initiatives, collaborating on certain challenges and missions in free-flowing constellations, and about shared ownership. So no ownership for the big bad state, nor for the hero entrepreneur, but we should share ownership as much as we can, because that creates a shared sense of responsibility for our future. This we kind of acronym into, that's especially in the European context, super important, shared values. And I'd like to just take those into the notion of shared cities rather than smart cities. As luck would have it, recently I received this beautiful brochure from the ABN AMRO Bank, which sees a city as a service, and I was quite startled by their, let's say, 90s attitude to cities, thinking that city is not something we own and are responsible for together, but it's a service that we can use as citizens. So I think definitely this is not the way to go. Generally speaking, I think it's really a wrong way of looking at cities. And so we say that shared cities are important. We have a certain type of definition for this acronym, but I think it's kind of free to be filled in different ways. But just to give you a little sort of kickoff, we need cities to be harmonious, effective, relevant, empowering, diverse, and sustainable in the way we approach its design together with citizens. So one of the main challenges I've found working with Kate Rayworth and on questions of open design related to the donut and technology is that we're not able to quantify this yet. So this whole donut is beautiful, and on a global level we can kind of quantify it, but on the city level we lack really the measurement and data set tooling to be able to properly understand what the consequences of our designs will be on an urban level. So that's kind of my challenge to this community, also to start designing a donut dashboard that works for cities, because we really needed to understand potential consequences of our designs and help us to make the right kind of choices and our impact. And then I'll go on a little more personal tangent. So basically what I'm talking about here is the idea of shared cities, producing knowledge in a shared way and also producing innovation in a shared and collaborative, collective way, with the outcomes also in the possession of the collective, more or less. But you could also wonder about shared value creation. If we look now at the way money is produced, in fact, 90 to 97% of money is produced by market organizations, by banks, which is interest-bearing debt. And I think it's really interesting on the city level to think about the notion of complementary currencies and to think about how we can connect the parameters with which we design our money to connect to these two rings of the donut, and to wonder how we can, let's say, design complementary currencies that help us and help citizens to move into this donut, to guide them into this donut. And I think this is a really interesting technological, economic, and design question. And this is my second challenge for you today, and also the ending of my presentation. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm actually very lucky because it's going to be a break after this, so we don't have to do mic switching, and that means that I don't have to come up with questions to ask you, but you can ask questions to Chris. So lucky you also. Does anybody have a question? Yes. So a hand already very quickly going up.
Thank you. Hey, Chris, thanks for the presentation. The work of the Waag Society is really awesome. I'm really triggered by these complementary currencies proposition you're making, especially now with these cryptocurrencies boom. It's an even more interesting paradigm because the alternative of the complementary currencies have been happening already for some time. But I was just wondering, how do you imagine them kind of coming to life? Because I see them happening very much on the sidelines.
Yeah.
Like they're maybe used by a certain community, but they haven't really reached the mainstream, and they tend to be very kind of segregated, or they kind of don't really last very long.
So my first statement also always on complementary currencies is that they're complementary to trust. So there always needs to be an amount of trust which you build a complementary currency on. And I think like a euro is something you need zero trust in each other to exchange. You just need trust in the central bank. So that's kind of a nice way to trade and exchange with people who you have no clue who they are, etc. So I think always by definition this idea of a complementary currency is more local. If we look at Kate's, let's say, levels of the economy, I think it's more towards the household and community or commons level than to the market or bigger market levels, let's say national or global markets. So I think it is embedded in a local context, and it needs to be connected to local economies. I think that's a major design challenge, is how to integrate them into local economies in a way that makes sense. I think in Ghent, the Toricus, Vita are a great example of really stitching that together on the micro level and really making it work in a certain context. So I don't think that scale is necessarily a requirement. I think crypto, because it is potentially speculative, is dangerous, and also in terms of the ecosystem, it's kind of problematic. The way that trust is put into crypto requires a lot of energy to maintain. Whereas I think the sources of trust within communities are things we have not managed to latch onto properly. The last thing I'll say is that if you look really into money production, how banks work, the central bank is the ultimate transaction settler between banks. So at a certain point you do need this central agency, I think on the city level, to guarantee the exchange between currencies or between transactions. So I think you should start this bottom up, and at a certain point the cities will have to stand up and work with this. But it's quite politically incorrect thing to say. I mean, there's a lot of course, pushback on these issues. So I think it's important to start on the local level and talk about the city and larger levels later once we have good use cases.